everybody. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. Thanks to everybody in the room and those who are watching virtually for joining this event today. We are going to discuss the Department of Defense 2023 Cyber Strategy. I have the strategy right here, and we'll dive into this, what's new, what's different, and where things go from here. To do that, we have two senior officials from the Department of Defense with us. First, we'll hear from Dr. John Plumb. Dr. Plumb was confirmed in March 2022 as the first Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. His policy portfolio encompasses strategic capabilities for integrated deterrence, so space, nuclear weapons, cyber, missile defense, electromagnetic warfare, countering weapons of mass destruction. I don't know how he does all of those things in one job, but nevertheless, that's a broad portfolio. And he also, and highly relevantly, serves as the principal cyber advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So in just a moment, Dr. Plumb will make some remarks about the strategy, and then after that, I will have a discussion up here with Mieke Eoyang, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. I'll introduce her a little bit more when we get started, and there'll be the opportunity for folks to ask questions whether you're in the room or online. So thanks to everybody for joining us. Thank you, John and Mieke and Dr. Plumb. Over to you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Richard. Thank you also to the Center for New American Security for hosting today's event. I am honored to be here, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to roll out the department's new strategy to achieve our national objectives in and through cyberspace. We are at a pivotal moment for cyber policy. The cyber threat environment has evolved significantly in recent years. China, the department's pacing challenge, continues to be actively engaged in campaigns of espionage, theft, and compromise against key defense networks and critical infrastructure, not only against us in the United States, but around the world. China views cyber as central to its theory of victory, and it dedicates its enormous resources and state control over industry to both reshape the global technology ecosystem and empower proxy organizations to pursue malicious cyber activity. Russia, North Korea, and Iran all remain persistent cyber threats. They engage in reckless and irresponsible activity against critical infrastructure. They conduct cyber espionage, and they support criminal cyber activity. And profit-motivated transnational criminal organizations target hospitals, educational institutions, and other civilian entities. As the U.S. witnessed with the disruption of the Colonial Pipeline system, ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure can have a significant impact on our society. But beyond the threat picture, there's something else making this a pivotal moment: Russia's unjustified and illegal war against Ukraine. Here is what some people call the first cyber war, and yet the impact of using cyber in that war has not been anywhere close to the dreaded magnitude that many had worried about. So taking all this together, DoD began internalizing some important lessons. And we are now embarking on a new chapter in our approach to cyber. This new chapter is laid out in our 2023 DoD Cyber Strategy. Now, this is the Department of Defense, so of course the strategy is actually classified. But to make sure we can discuss the strategy with our allies, our partners, industry, key stakeholders like all of you in this room or online, it's important to have an unclassified summary. So I'm excited to present that today. But before we get into the details, let me take a few minutes to retrace the steps that got us here. I personally find it helpful to break the last 10 to 15 years up into 3 distinct chapters in DoD's evolution of our approach to cyber. So let's start with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 begins in 2010 with the establishment of U.S. Cyber Command as a sub-unified command. Cyber Command was created to bring together the cyber forces from across the different services, but it was placed under U.S. Strategic Command. That's our command for U.S. nuclear forces. And in many ways, that reflected our early thinking when it came to cyber operations. Instead of viewing cyber as a domain that could be leveraged in both competition and conflict, at that time, the department more or less viewed cyber operations as something analogous to nuclear weapons, You wanted them in reserve as a deterrent, but then you worked very hard to make sure you'd never have to use them. Back then in 2010, the department was most concerned with the prospect of what some senior leaders had termed a cyber Pearl Harbor, a massive hack that would dismantle the US power grid, transportation systems, financial networks, and our government. But it turns out that wasn't the real problem. Instead of a crippling cyber attack, the predominant threat at the time was actually cyber-enabled espionage. In other words, states, and here I mean primarily China, were stealing our secrets and our intellectual property. Over 22 million records of security clearance investigations were exfiltrated in the 2015 data breach of the Office of Personnel Management. Blueprints to our cutting-edge aircraft, IP for our breakthrough pharmaceuticals, even innovations in agriculture, all stolen. Over the years, it has added up to trillions of dollars of economic theft. There was a clear trend of cyber being employed below the threshold of armed conflict, but to the strategic benefit of our competitors. And while the cyber Pearl Harbor didn't materialize, something new did. A coordinated cyber operation to influence the 2016 US presidential election. It was abundantly clear to even the casual observer that we needed to do more to protect the nation. And that led us to our next chapter in our cyber approach. So chapter 2 starts in about 2018 when we begin to address these problems. First, Cyber Command was elevated to a unified combatant command. Second, the department received new authorities to streamline the approval process for cyber operations. And third, the department unveiled a new strategy that we called Defend Forward, defending our networks by disrupting malicious cyber activity before it can affect the homeland. So those changes ushered in a new approach to cyberspace operations. Early success in defending forward to deter and prevent interference in the 2018 midterms led to new operations to actively disrupt malicious activity at its source. And we also tried a novel idea, helping our allies and partners not only by sharing threat information, but also by operating side by side with them on their networks at their invitation to track down malicious activity. We called these hunt forward operations, and it took our cyber cooperation to the next level, helping build capacity and resilience not just for our own country, but for others. So against this backdrop, we arrive at chapter 3 in our approach to cyber. With Russia's further invasion of Ukraine in 2022, we have for the first time witnessed the role that sophisticated cyber operations can play in a modern conventional conflict. This is something we continue to see in real time, but there are already some clear lessons we have internalized. For example, Russian operations have demonstrated that cyber does not take place in a vacuum, and it does not appear to be especially decisive on its own. In conflict, cyber operations are best understood as a complement to conventional missions rather than a standalone capability. Despite the initial burst of malicious cyber activity by Russia against Ukrainian networks to cut off or control access to information and communications, Russia has been unable to use cyber to produce strategic effects. Now why? Well, in large part, this is due to Ukraine's excellent and enduring cybersecurity and cyber resilience. Ukraine has been dealing with malicious cyber activity from Russia for many years. In fact, Ukraine was one of our first partners for hunt forward operations. Ukraine credited a hunt forward on their rail networks with keeping the trains operating during the initial phase of the invasion, allowing nearly 1 million civilians to escape to safety and critical supplies to be delivered to the war zone. The private sector also stepped up in ways to support Ukraine that we could not have predicted. In advance of Russia's 2022 invasion, Amazon Web Services facilitated the transfer of Ukrainian state databases to cloud storage outside of Ukraine, and that enabled continuity of Ukraine's government. Google restricted access to certain features of its maps. They blocked access to several YouTube channels of Russian state media. Starlink donated thousands of terminals to Ukraine, helping to enable command and control of Ukrainian forces on the battlefield. Microsoft, Mandiant, and others provided free cyber defense support to Ukraine, including sharing information about threats to their networks and setting up special cyber defense teams that provided direct support to Ukrainian network defenders. So these remarkable and innovative measures taken by the private sector have had a direct impact on the course of the war in Ukraine in ways that we are only beginning to fully understand. But what has become abundantly clear to the United States is that cyber resilience is the best cyber defense. And that extends to our allies and partners, including industry. Being resilient in cyber requires all of us. So that brings us to today. The 2023 Department of Defense Cyber Strategy is the next chapter in our approach to cyber. This is the department's fourth cyber strategy, and it represents the Secretary's vision for operationalizing the 2022 National Defense Strategy in cyberspace. It also complements President Biden's National Security Strategy and National Cybersecurity Strategy. Now, our cyber strategy that we're talking about today is not an aspirational document. It's grounded in real-world experience. It builds on the 2018 strategy by drawing on the lessons learned from years of conducting cyber operations and our close observation of how cyber has been used in the war in Ukraine. So with that experience, our new strategy outlines 4 complementary lines of effort the department will pursue. For our first line of effort, we will defend the nation by campaigning in and through cyberspace to generate insights about malicious cyber actors. And we will defend forward to disrupt and degrade these actors' capabilities in supporting ecosystems. But unlike in the past, today we have a better appreciation for both the potential and limitation of cyber operations. Cyber capabilities are most effective when used in concert with other instruments of national power, creating a deterrent that is greater than the sum of its parts, what we call integrated deterrence. In election security, for instance, cyberspace operations may work best in concert with the FBI and sanctions from the Department of Treasury. Coordinated efforts by government and non-government entities have proven effective in frustrating malicious cyber activity from foreign governments, and from criminals, and from other threat actors, all at scale. This is why the US government has been increasing our capacity to work together with the private sector to deny adversaries the use of US-based infrastructure and to thwart malicious global campaigns. So that's defend the nation. For our second line of effort, we will be prepared to fight and win the nation's wars. We'll do this by ensuring the cybersecurity of the DoD, the Department of Defense Information Network, and investing in the cyber resilience of our joint force. We once aspired to defend every network, but that is impractical. To deter aggression and prevailing conflict, we must demonstrate resilience in cyberspace, the ability to take a punch without losing a critical function. One of the many ways we are getting after this is by migrating to a zero-trust architecture. That's a difficult but essential goal to work towards to drive down risk. The department will also use cyberspace operations to create advantages in support of joint force plans and operations. For example, in large-scale conflict, US cyberspace operations may enable the delivery of kinetic effects. For our third line of effort, we will build enduring advantages in cyberspace. We will optimize the organizing, training, and equipping of the cyber operations forces and the service-retained cyber forces. And we will invest in enablers of cyberspace operations, including intelligence and science and technology. Our most important cyber capability is our people, those with the talent, creativity, and sense of mission necessary to defend our nation in cyberspace. The department will prioritize reforms to our cyber workforce and empower the services to implement effective talent management. And for our fourth, perhaps our most significant line of effort related to this strategy, we will prioritize cooperation with allies and partners by helping build their cyber capacity and capability. Our allies and partners are an asymmetric advantage. They're a force multiplier, and it's something that neither China nor Russia can ever hope to match. That's why cooperation with allies and partners is so central to our national defense strategy. And with our new cyber strategy, cooperation with allies and partners is now one of the department's core missions in cyberspace. We will help build out our partners' cyber capacity, shore up their networks through hunt-forward operations, and we will enhance information sharing relationships to share more actionable threat information. We will expand the number of partners with whom we engage. We will work to knock down institutional barriers that inhibit cooperation. And we will ensure that our definition of partner extends to the private sector. The private sector is absolutely essential in our collective efforts to become more cyber resilient, from adopting cyber best practices to mitigating threats in a crisis. So that's where we are in the story right now, but there's much left to write, and more importantly, there's much left to do. The speed, the scale, and the sophistication of cyber attacks from states or criminal organizations will continue to increase. We cannot let our guard down. It's up to all of us, including everyone in this room, everyone online, all of our teams, to help build the cyber resilience necessary to confront the threats of today and to be ready to adapt to the threats of tomorrow, a team effort. And I do need to be clear, while the Secretary is tasking the department with this new cyber strategy, our success as a nation is not just up to the U.S. military. It can't be. It requires close cooperation across the U.S. interagency, with allies, and with partners, including industry. Because in the cyber domain, as in so many things, we are stronger together. So, thank you again for this opportunity. Thanks to the Center for New American Security for hosting today's event, and I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Distinct pleasure to speak with my friend Mieke Eoyang, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. So her office is responsible for establishing the department's cyberspace policy and strategy, guidance and oversight on cyberspace activities, managing the external relationships that the U.S. government has in both in the private sector and with key allies and partners, and other sort of domestic stakeholders. Before this, among many other things, she was Senior Vice President for National Security at the think tank Third Way and led their cyber enforcement initiative there. So great to have you. And,
Richard, thank you so much.
Lots to talk about. I thought actually, and I was thinking as John was making his remarks, maybe we could talk about the diagnosis that the strategy is responding to first, and then talk a little bit about the strategy and some of the steps that the department is taking in order to deal with the diagnosis of the threat. Before I dive into questions, if there are folks online who have questions, you can put them in the chat box. And in a few moments, or maybe more than a few moments, I'll go to the folks in the room too, so be thinking of things that you might want to ask the Deputy Assistant Secretary. So, okay, so first on the diagnosis. So Dr. Plumb just talked about China. The strategy talks about China. It talks about China almost exclusively as an espionage threat in cyberspace, theft of intellectual property, espionage against American citizens, and so forth. Are there other forms of Chinese malicious cyber activity that you're concerned about? Disinformation, harm to physical assets, other kinds of things?
Yeah, I think that we're worried about China from a range of perspectives. I mean, I think when we talk about China as the pacing challenge for the United States, which we talk about in the NDS and National Security Strategy just writ large, but in the cyber domain, it has a very specific concern that we have here, which is not just about their cyber capability, which is quite large, some of the things that you mentioned. We are, of course, as the Department of Defense, quite worried about their ability to integrate their own cyber capabilities into their military capabilities. We are concerned about the possibility that they could try and sow chaos in the United States or disrupt our military mobilization in a time of crisis or conflict. But the other thing that we see with the PRC that's a real challenge is the heavy hand that the government has on their technology sector and the ways in which they could try and shape the global technology environment consistent with their view of digital authoritarianism. That is quite problematic from a national security perspective. It's problematic from an operational perspective.
Okay, so that's China. We can dig into that maybe a little bit more later on. And then on Russia, ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were plenty of warnings that because the United States was actively aiding Ukraine militarily, there were likely to be the sort of Russian cyber brigades unleashed on the United States, that we would see who knows what. There could be all kinds of malicious cyber activity, and we haven't seen it. So John talked about why Ukraine has been resilient in the face of the Russian cyber threat. But why haven't we seen stuff here? Is it we're really good, or it's restraint, or is there some other reason?
I think there's a combination of things. Like we can never, and I don't think we want to take for granted the Russian cyber capability because it is quite extensive. And I think Ukraine's ability to counter that has been very impressive and at a scale that no other country, I think, around the world has had to deal with. But I think also what happened here is that President Biden was very clear with the Russians about how he would view an attack on U.S. critical infrastructure via cyber. And made that message clear to them. It is in Russia's interest not to have the United States or NATO join the fight. Disruption to US critical infrastructure could, for them, be a grave miscalculation and really raise escalation costs, hardening views here, and something to which, depending on what it is, we might have to respond. So I think that there is a combination of things here. In addition to that, the administration was very forward-leaning on sharing information with the private sector as part of what some of you may recall CISA's Shields Up activity to try and encourage the private sector to harden their defenses against what we expected might be Russian attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure. And in the Department of Defense worked very hard with our domestic partners to be able to declassify and share actionable intelligence, threat information, so that they could better defend their own networks.
And then, obviously, in 2016, there was this major operation conducted largely, but not exclusively, through cyber means to first sow dissension and discord in the context of the presidential election, and then to help one of the candidates carried out by, intelligence elements of the Russian state. And we haven't seen anything nearly that pronounced and profound in 18 and 20 and 22. Here we are in 23. John talked a little bit about, our own defenses getting better and sort of knowledge of the threat. Do you attribute that, all of the absence of what now we should say we have seen things, we just haven't seen them on the scale that we saw them in 2016. Or how much of this is restraint, or the Russians or anyone else saying there's not a candidate we want in this election, or how much of this is what's coming in, and how much of this is what we're stopping?
Yeah, so I can't speak to what's going on inside Putin's mind or what the Russian plans may be for 24. I wish I knew, because then I'd be in a better position to defend against it. I do think that the 2016 election and what Russia attempted there was very consequential for the Department of Defense. It fundamentally shifted our orientation towards the need to include election defense as part of our mission, and to be in a position to try and disrupt attempts at foreign malign influence against the essential mechanism of US sovereignty. And so Cyber Command has been involved in election defense in every election since then. Certainly we worry about 2024, we worry about attempts to try and change the sovereignty of the United States by external actors in clandestine ways, but the department views its election defense mission as a no-fail mission.
Okay, so last question on the diagnosis side. Everybody talks about AI all day long now, and has woken up to the existence of large language models. What kind of challenges do AI-driven cyber capabilities present to the kind of defenses that you have been talking about and that John was talking about?
Yeah, so it's a little bit difficult to go into the details on this at a technical level. But I think where we are talking about trying to do analysis of things at scale, AI has real possibilities here for us in trying to speed up our ability to identify malicious or anomalous activity, in identifying malicious code in places, things that, if done manually, take quite some time. There are places where we can do that. But I think that depending on how people are defining AI and machine learning, there are places in the Department of Defense where we have been using algorithmic learning and identification for quite some time.
Okay, so let's go from diagnosis to prescription, and obviously the strategy at some level is a prescription for how to deal with some of the threats that you just talked about. Maybe we could start, we were talking about a little bit about this before we came in, about what are some of the misconceptions that you have to deal with before you actually get to what the strategy should be and the implementation of the strategy?
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge on cyber is that many of us who are national security professionals, and Richard, you and I have been in this business a long time, import a lot of that.
Not that long. I mean, anyway, sorry.
I mean, we're pre-9/11 kids, so. You know, I think for a lot of folks, you import a lot of the mental models and assumptions that you have from kinetic or the nuclear domain into this.
Yeah.
But cyber is actually quite different. And so when you try and import those deterrence models, there are a bunch of things about cyber that just don't work. Like, a lot of times people think about deterrence, it's like, let me show you how intimidating my capability is going to be, and then you back down. But in the cyber domain, if you show me how intimidating your capability is, I'm just going to try and figure out how to build a patch or block your access. Like, it's a really valuable defensive thing to me if you just show it to me without executing it. So like, deterrence doesn't work the same way because you have no guarantee of repeatability. Also, like, the sort of attribution of these things is not the same. And often these are clandestine operations. So like, how do you impose deterrence if your adversary never knows that you did a thing, or you never knew that your adversary did a thing? So there are a lot of places where, because of cyber's history in the Department of Defense coming from STRATCOM and this nuclear deterrence model, we have assumed, as you heard Dr. Plumb say, that you could like build these fearsome capabilities and hope you never use them and put them on the shelf for some day. But technology changes, the dynamics change, that deterrence model just doesn't work. And if you put cyber in the wrong place on the escalation ladder or have the wrong deterrence frame, you are fundamentally not using it, or you're fundamentally misdiagnosing how you would use it in the context of warfighting. So there's been a lot of experience that we, the department, have learned. We did learn, right, at the outset of the Russia-Ukraine conflict that first cyber salvo that we expected was not going to have that decisive impact. It makes you rethink how you use cyber in an armed conflict. And so we had to rethink some of those things, but it is a challenge, I think, to the extent that only the cyber people understand those distinctions, that other policymakers, other think tankers, folks who are opining about what the department should or shouldn't do with cyber, if they misunderstand what that is, then they're asking us to do things that are fundamentally ill-suited to the technology.
So there's one of the things you often hear is, well, all the interesting activities are happening in classified area anyway, so certainly people outside of government, beyond some very high level of abstraction, are going to have a really hard time thinking through the concepts that you were just talking about. And then even within the government, unless you have the right access, then that's difficult too. So one, is that right? And two, if it is, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that has been a real challenge. And as cyber has sort of started as a military domain thing, and we've thought about it in those ways, it has in fact been very classified. But you know, in the sort of post-China espionage era, one of the big threats that we've seen in the cyber domain is all of these ransomware actors and a lot of criminal actors who use very similar tactics and techniques to be able to gain access and cause disruption that are problems on the law enforcement side of the house. And so we can talk about those kinds of things and what you need to do for network management and security in the context of those things. And then the kinds of things that the government does to be able to disrupt those things that are done on the law enforcement side of the house are really interesting examples that we can talk about the kinds of things that we might be able to do later. And that includes things like where the FBI gets orders to remove malware around the world to disrupt adversaries' ability to continue to cause disruptions. There are places like that where there is a conversation to be had where we can talk through some of the big picture challenges to give people a better understanding. And we've worked really hard, and it's part of why the unclassified summary is so robust, to try and be able to have more of that conversation with the national security community, with the observers, and with the American public.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I've got a bunch more, but if folks in the room have them, I'll go to you very soon, and if folks online have them and want to put them into the chat box, we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I wanted to ask about kind of the current level of understanding about how the law of armed conflict applies in the cyber domain. So For years, there's been these sort of debates about the principle of neutrality and whether packets of information that travel through servers in a neutral country, if that's a violation on its way to conducting some activity in an adversary country, does that, or, you know, civilian harm and, you know, critical infrastructure that is being used for largely civilian, you know, there are all these kind of dilemmas. And so I assume those have all been worked out.
Oh, yeah, solid.
And so that's what that, I'm just simply yes or no suffice. No,
Actually, Richard, I would say there's a lot of work for think tanks to do in this space in terms of understanding the application of the laws of armed conflict to the cyber domain.
No, but so one, I mean, is that limiting what we want to do? Is the uncertainty around that limiting what we want to do? And is it really true that there is a lot more kind of work that has to be done in order to pin down how we want to think about cyber activities in the framework of the law of armed conflict?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think that like a lot of people have been trying to define like what is the line for like a cyber act of war. And I actually think that the Russia-Ukraine conflict provides us with a different way to think about that, which is not necessarily what is the cyber thing that starts the war, but what is the appropriate use of cyber in the war. Right. And as we think about it from the Department of Defense, we believe in the laws of armed conflict as an obligation on our activities, and those are all domain commitments. So there are certain things that we would not do with a missile, and we would not do them via cyber, right? We are not trying to attack hospitals, for example. But there, I think, are a lot of misconceptions that adversaries may have on the civilian harm question that we think are inconsistent with obligations under the laws of armed conflict. The deliberate imposition of harm on civilians, say trying to leave an entire city of civilians in the dark. That is something that does not meet our principles of military necessity, proportionality, right? There may come a time like deep into a conflict where you have to consider that because there's some military necessity going on here. But the idea that it is for the purpose of civilian harm, for the idea of sowing chaos, we would consider that an anathema. But most of the conversation around norms has been about the peacetime norms of responsible state behavior. There has been less talk about what are the obligations within armed conflict itself.
Great. Let's go to here, right in front. Yes, sir. And is there a mic coming? There is a mic coming around right to you.
Hi, Mark Pomerleau with Defense Scoop. We've heard a lot about observations from Russia, Ukraine, but to what extent have U.S. operations helped to inform the strategy? Obviously, there weren't a lot of operations pre-2018, so to what extent have you taken some of the operations post-2018 and internalized those and helped to inform the new strategy here?
Yeah, that is we are very clear in the strategy that our operations post-2018 do definitely inform the strategy, and especially as we think about the critical enablers, identifying those things that we need to work on in the department. Those are informed by a lot of our, I think, recognizing our bureaucratic challenges and some of the things that we are going to need to do to make sure that cyber is an enduring part of our warfighting capability. I'm not going to get into the specifics of particular operations, but I think there is some recognition about those cyber operations, how long it takes to develop, what kinds of skills are needed, those types of things that we recognize we need to think more carefully about.
There's a question, an online question from Guadalupe. Will the DoD consider a cyber attack on private infrastructure, such as Starlink, an attack on the DIB?
I think how we characterize and attribute particular cyber attacks or disruptions is really a fact-dependent question, right? These are questions about who did it, what's the level of outage, all of those things. I think as we look at Starlink and to the extent that there are, or companies like that that are providing services to the Department of Defense, there are ways in which they fall into the categorization of the DIB, and the DIB is a critical infrastructure sector. But how we would call it and how we would attribute it, that has some political and policy, small p political and policy consequences. And so we would have to make a determination based on the factors at the time.
Okay. Yes, Josh.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming today. I really appreciate it. My question is on the limitations on partnerships. So the Assistant Secretary mentioned that the new strategy has a aspect of expanding partnerships to new countries, and so I'm curious about what is on the table and who is across the table gets determined, and where the limitations are.
Yeah, I think what we have seen is that cyber becomes an increasingly important part of the conversation with many countries, and how we talk about it with them and what tools we have to address the concerns that they have is a really important question for the Department of Defense, and one that we need to figure out how to address. And in the department, we have been very good at addressing, say, military capability, arms sales, things like that, trainings. For the conventional military, we need to think about, and we are developing the tools that we need to be able to help our partners develop cyber forces, as well as tools to help them with network management. As Assistant Secretary Plumb mentioned, we talk a lot about and have put a lot of emphasis on our hunt forward operations, which helps our partners understand the kinds of threat information that we have and be able to secure their networks as well. But there are many, many tools, and it has been an area of emphasis in the department.
So there's a question from Karen online who says, how do you think about cyber strategy as compared to cyber security strategy? So this is the 2023 cyber strategy of the Department of Defense. But if you go back to, I guess, before 2018, it was a cyber strategy. So Karen thinks the wording different means something, asks if you do. I wonder, isn't cyber an adjective, or is it also a noun?
Well, I'm not going to get into a debate about parts of speech on this one.
Legitimate question.
But I think for us, it is not just about cybersecurity. It's not just about the security of our networks, though perhaps our adversaries are sending us a message by flickering the lights.
That was for effect.
But cybersecurity implies a certain a defensive posture, and the cyber strategy is about how we incorporate cyber capabilities into our entire suite of warfighting capabilities to include offensive capabilities.
Okay. Let's see. Do we have someone else in the room? Otherwise, I'll go. There's a bunch of questions that have come in here. So, Michael, it says the department often states China is the pacing threat. So how are they doing? Is the scale of their commercial and private sector exfiltrations of Western IP continuing, reducing, or expanding?
Well, I think that the sort of metrics baseline on that one is a challenge, as they are clandestine activities by the PRC. So I'm not going to characterize.
Dr. Plumb quantified the value of the theft.
Well, there's the OPM theft, and there have been economic estimates of it. Whether or not it's increasing, decreasing, I'm not going to get into.
All right, fine.
Sorry, the first part of the question.
Well, that was the question. How are they doing, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, the big thing is, it's not just about IP theft, right? When we look at the Microsoft Volt Typhoon announcement about potential disruption on Guam, it's not just about IP theft going on. It's not just about data going out. It's about malicious code coming in that could deliver some kind of effect that could affect the real world. And that is a very different question than where it's traditional, what people have thought about historically as China's cyber capabilities. There are a range of things. And there have also been some, I think, disturbing policy developments in China, including the requirement of disclosure of zero-day vulnerabilities to the government first. In the US, we don't do that. Security researchers disclose things all the time. Private sector goes ahead and patches all the time. We are not mandating some kind of government-first response to that, because we believe in a free, open, secure internet globally, and not one that is dominated by national security, Department of Defense interests.
Right. Okay. Let's see. Jesse, related to China disrupting U.S. military mobilization via cyber, uses it as a noun, how does the DoD think about CCP-linked equipment and software in use at U.S. maritime ports? Is this a big deal?
I think that we have a lot of concern about CCP-linked equipment across a range of things. We have obviously been very vocal about our concerns about Huawei equipment in U.S. telecommunications networks. And I think we are working aggressively to try and identify that equipment and try to identify the risk and then find resilience and mitigation measures.
Okay, so if you're about to build a maritime port in the United States, you should not be first looking into CCP-linked equipment and software, is part of the message here.
We would recommend not.
Okay, all right, got it. I got it. All right, so we got that down. That's affirmative. Let's see. Mark asked, does the failure of traditional deterrence concepts in the cyber domain require rethinking of game theoretic approaches to conflict? You can expound on that off the top of your I mean, you touched a bit on the problems of traditional deterrence concepts as applied, transposed from, say, the nuclear realm into the cyber realm, but there are, of course, a number of ways that one can and does deter in cyberspace, right? And that's part of this whole strategy.
Yeah, I think that there are questions about, like, if your game theory about working through what we should do relies on your adversary knowing that you did a thing and responding to it, or being intimidated by the thing and responding to it, cyber might not be your best bet for that. We have many other tools in the Department of Defense to convey that message. Cyber may not necessarily be your best bet for signaling. It may, however, be a really important tool for denying your adversary a capability. It may be an important tool for protecting your own networks. It may be an important tool for enhancing certain things. But it may not be, right, how it works in sort of war games and game theory, I think, is a different question, and I think probably the game constructors will have to worry about that.
Ali asks, how does DoD plan to encourage, support, and incentivize innovation in cyber and AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is tremendous innovation already happening. How we encourage that, I think we are always looking for innovative tools. I think we spend a lot of time partnering with our colleagues in DARPA, partnering with our colleagues in R&E. There are robust efforts in those areas to try and encourage that kind of innovation.
And other countries as well?
And other countries as well.
Georgina has a question. What kind of information do you intend to share, and what will this new age of information sharing with the private sector look like? That's a big question.
Yeah, I think you see us starting to share already that kind of information. You have seen us put out cybersecurity advisories, warnings about particular kinds of malware that we're seeing, where once we might have said, oh no, we can't tell anybody about that because the fact that the adversary did it is so sensitive we could never share. But now we have figured out ways to share that information, working with FBI, working with CISA, working with the private sector, to ensure that we are getting particular types of technical information out so that people know, hey, this particular vulnerability, this particular thing needs to be patched. And so we have been figuring out how to do that and move forward on that, so that there's particular information that the cybersecurity community writ large knows that they need to do to protect their networks.
Jenny has a question. What are some metrics that DoD uses to evaluate whether campaigns conducted for Defend Forward are working or not? What's the cumulative effect end goal?
Yeah, I think that these are hard things to measure. It's sort of like, how do you know how much cybersecurity is enough? And so that's like a bigger fundamental question that I think the entire industry is wrestling with. We have seen some places where we can measure a certain amount of like malware identified and removed, configurations patched, things like that. Things that we know are like unlocked backdoors in partner networks that need to be locked and things like that, so that we can measure certain things. But whether or not there's sort of a net, you're 100% secure, you're 98% secure, you're 70% secure, I think that we don't have good ways of measuring all that. Because, and that this is not just a DoD problem, this is like a cybersecurity problem. Because the tactics of the malicious cyber actor, be they criminal or nation state, change all the time. So the thing that you thought was secure at one point, you may discover once something has happened that, oh wait, there was another vulnerability that I wasn't tracking. And now I have to go back and worry about this. And that sort of thing happens all the time. It's why we have Patch Tuesday.
Patch Tuesday. Mark your calendars, everyone, for Patch Tuesday.
Everyone, please, whenever.
Say what Patch Tuesday is
So,
for those who aren't following this quite as closely as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense was saying.
So now companies like Apple, Google, others have automatic updates. So there are certain periods of time where they say, we are going to patch a whole bunch of things. When you get that notice that like your provider has issued some patches and they recommend that you update your systems now, I recommend that you update your systems now. Please stay up to date. I know it's a hassle when you're in the middle of your favorite show and you have to update your system. But it's really important from a cybersecurity perspective that everyone stay up to date on those things.
And so you talked about information sharing with the private sector from government to the private sector. What about in the reverse direction? I mean, so if someone who's not in government discovers a threat or a particular compromise or a vulnerability, do they know who to call?
So there are many places that you can call in the government. There's not one single place to call, and depending on the private sector actor and depending on the thing that it is, that we would not say, oh, you must call, I'm not going to say 1-800 report vulnerability here. Like, that's not how we work in the government. But different people may be working with different parts of the government. It may be a vendor for us. It may be a company that's engaging with CISA or a company that's been notified of something by the FBI, and like they can talk to any of us and we will figure it out on the back end about how we share that information.
And do you feel a difference between, I mean, I'm just conjecturing here, but people in the private sector are more comfortable if they want to call somebody in the government approaching the FBI as opposed to the Department of Defense, given DoD's warfighting role and all of that? Or, I mean, how does that work in terms of the engagement with the private sector? And is that at sort of a sufficient level, do you think, at this point, or is this a place to make inroads?
Yeah, I think that we can always do better in private sector engagement and making sure the private sector knows who to call. And people turn over all the time, so making sure that those relationships remain fresh. There are also companies that are part of the defense industrial base, so they have a strong relationship with us, and so they're more comfortable coming in to talk to the Department of Defense than they might be coming to talk to CISA, or vice versa. And so we're happy to have those conversations. We do a lot of industry engagement as the Sector Risk Management Agency for the DIB. I know other departments and agencies do regular engagements through their SRMAs to their industries so that people know who to call and know who to talk to. If folks haven't made contact with their local FBI field agent in advance of cyber incidents, knowing who to call. If you all of a sudden get some sort of pop-up notice that says all your data now belong to us, there are things that knowing who to talk to, especially before a crisis, is really valuable.
Will we ever fight a war again without a significant cyber component to it?
I doubt it.
Okay, just wanted to check on that.
We are, Richard, as you know, we are one of the most wired modern militaries in the world. At a minimum, our own need to defend our systems to prevent cyber disruption to our own forces is going to play a large part in our warfighting abilities.
What about the workforce? How is the DoD workforce, given the competitive dynamics in the cyber field, the salaries and careers in the tech field? You've got to recruit, retain some of the best people to do the kind of work that's necessary to execute this strategy. What does that challenge look like?
This is a challenge that, as I talk to international partners around the world, they are also wrestling with. Industry's appetite for highly trained cyber talent is insatiable, and we are very good in the Department of Defense at training people to understand adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures, to run sophisticated global networks. So we have very in-demand people, and so it is a real challenge for us. The other thing that we have in the Department of Defense is a mission that nobody else does. Right? There had been a long debate back when I was in the think tank world about hack back and should the private sector hack back at the people who are coming at them, and that has all kinds of liability problems. But we as the Department of Defense have authorization to hack back. We are one of the few, it's only the US government really that can actually engage in that kind of offensive cyber activity, and so for a lot of people who would like to be engaging in that, we are a place where you can do that. But we recognize that the workforce is essential to our cyber capability, and it's important that we get it right. And so we are undertaking a very large study in the Department of Defense to look at our current force generation model, to compare it to alternatives. There are pros and cons to every model. We certainly are aware of the cons of our current model, but there are cons in other hypothetical models as well. And so we need to understand what we're dealing with, whether or not the way that we have it with some tweaks is the best way to go, whether or not a different model is the way to go. It's all really premature to say, but it is imperative for us in the Department of Defense that we get the people part of this right.
I'm glad you emphasize the sexiness of what you get to do in addition to the opportunity to serve your country. Because of course, the opportunity to serve your country is a privilege. It's highly attractive to people. It's a great motivator, and it should be. Yeah. but the kind of stuff that you can do when you're in some of these jobs is just amazing, and you will not be exposed to those opportunities in the private sector.
I mean,
right?
Richard, it's the coolest part of my job.
Well, there you go. There you go. There you have it. It almost made me forget what I was going to ask you next, because now I'm thinking about the coolest part of your job. One of the things that I'm sure there's an answer to, but at least to me is not obvious, is we have a proliferating number of centers and places within the government that do things that you've been talking about, right? So there's CISA, and there's the National Cyber Director, and there's a Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, and the DoD does cyber, and FBI does cyber, and DHS does cyber, and NSA has cybercom in it. So how do all these things work together or not?
Yeah. Look, I think we in the Department of Defense have a really important role to play, not only in delivery of cyber into our warfighting capability, which is like us alone, but as a critical enabler of a lot of those other missions. So we find ourselves often working closely with the other agencies on their missions. And so it's been, that part of this job has been also very interesting.
And that's because you have the capacity that they lack, or the expertise, or all of those?
Sometimes it's that we have tools that they may lack, or insights that they may lack. Sometimes it may be that like the victim or the affected network is a shared concern, right? They're a DIB provider, but they're also providing other services in a different sector. So like there are a lot of different places where, or it's like, right, we're dealing with an international partner, that's both us and the State Department. There are a lot of places where we have shared and overlapping responsibilities. But you know, it's really important that we have all of these, because we all have very different missions, and cyber is not a thing on its own. It's a critical enabler of those other missions, which is why, right, FBI thinks about this from the context of like criminal law enforcement. What are these cyber criminals doing? We think about it in the context of war fighting. Other people think about it in the context of other things, and it's important not to lose those perspectives and put the primacy of the cyber over the government function that we are trying to do. But it is also really important that we have people who understand the cybers, to be able to coordinate those activities across the government and understand where we might need to smooth out bureaucratic hurdles, develop additional tools, things like that.
Okay. Last question, and this is not about speech or verbs or adjectives or anything else. What's left undone? So what in this strategy, what's the next horizon of priorities that is not done today or not done adequately in order to get to the place where we have the maximum ability to do the kinds of things that are both described in strategy as objectives and what you and John talked about here?
Yeah, so the strategy is not a report card. It's a to-do list, right? So when we talk about the critical enablers and the things that we still have to do, we have to get people right. We need to think about how intelligence works. We have to build a bunch of tools. There are a lot of things that are on our to-do list as reflected in this strategy. There are some of the things that are ongoing activities that we will continue to have to do, but this is not a report card of all the ways in which the department has solved or solved things or accomplished things. It is a list of things that we still have to get after.
Okay, but so what are some priority areas for you? So of those things on the to-do list, what's at the top of mind that is to do?
Yeah, as I mentioned, people, right? Getting people right is at the top of the to-do list. For me, understanding how intelligence supports cyber and how cyber supports intelligence, those are really important things for us to do. In the pre-9/11 days, right, you think about targeting and you think about like in the Cold War days, like what our intelligence enterprise would do, and it was enough to just identify, oh, this is my adversary's airbase or headquarters or whatever, and then it was like, you'd put munitions on it. In the cyber domain, it's not just enough to identify where that thing is physically located. It's like, well, what is its network diagram, and like what's it running, and like how do I think about those things, and like there's an additional layer of understanding the technical footprint of those things that's different than it is in the kinetic space. And we spent many years focused on counterterrorism, and I think there's a lot of things that we need to do as the department to shift to thinking about how we are doing, how we are thinking about the challenges that we have with nation states with formidable militaries on their own in light of the cyber and the technological advancement that has happened over the period when we were focused on counterterrorism.
Great. This is the 2023 Cyber Strategy. It's not very long either, so it's a relatively compact.
It is because it's the unclassified summary.
Well, I was going to say for people who wanted to read it. So I was trying to encourage people, if they would like to learn more, that they could actually read the strategy themselves. If you want the classified version, get yourself a security clearance, you'll be thrown in jail. Mieke, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to everybody here in the room and online for all the great questions and for joining us today. And we will see you at our next event. Thanks very much.